encourage everyone, I would encourage everyone, to read it, because Brian has done a lot of research, and the book breaks new ground. I mean, especially due to the fact that Brian has had access under the Freedom of Information Act, to US embassy or US government cables, which reveal a lot of, what went on during the period, or during Thomas Sankara's period in Burkina Faso. We also have a great favorite of mine, because I started reading his works as an undergraduate at university, Ernest Harsh, and he's written a great deal on the African continent, right from a pamphlet that first sparked my interest, which was on the Ethiopian Revolution. He's written a book on apartheid South Africa, which I still have. He's written a major history, of Burkina Faso. And he has also published a volume in the Ohio Short Histories of Africa, on Thomas Sankara. This is it here. And I would advise everybody to get hold of this, because it's a great book, and it sort of uncovers a lot of the distortions and mystifications, around, Thomas Sankara and what went on in Burkina Faso during that period between 1983 and 1987, when Sankara died. And if I may add that the 15th of October 1987 remains scarred in my mind, because it's the first time that I've ever cried, when an African head of state has been assassinated. The majority of them, quite frankly, are scumbags, and they still remain so. But as African heads of state and heads of government go, Thomas Sankara was in a class of his own. So that's enough about me talking. We've got 3 of the speakers so far. We have Brian Peterson, we have Ernest Harsh, and we have a comrade from Burkina Faso, Didier. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes to discuss. Afterwards, the floor will be opened for contributions, comments, clarifications, after which each of the speakers will be given 5 minutes to sum up. So once again, I thank all the speakers for taking the time to grace us with their presence. And I hope this is going to be a very, very interesting meeting. So I'd like to start with Brian Peterson. Brian, who's the author of Thomas Sankara, A Revolutionary in Cold War Africa. So Brian, you have 15 minutes, and the floor is open to you. Thank you.
Can you allow the video, or is it says it's unable to start? The host has stopped the video or something? Does that sound?
Comrade Povey, can you allow the video? Yeah. Excellent, great.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so let me pull up some slides if you don't mind. Can you allow screen share? Is that possible on your side of things?
Comrade Povey, can we allow a screen share? Comrade Povey.
Yes, as far as I can see, he can.
Right.
So he shares the screen.
It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I think you have to go into.
Well, it does say it's one participant can share at a time is ticked, so I don't know.
Let's see here.
Oh, okay. Try that.
You might have to go into another setting where it says allow.
Try it now.
There we go. Okay. So, you know, I think you'd rather have a look at Sankara and some images than myself, but and I also want to show you some things to color this presentation a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, thanks for inviting me, y'all, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about Sankara today. So, Takumbo asked me to shed some light on Sankara's assassination, drawing on my research and the book that he was just mentioning. So I'm going to say a few things about that today and try to frame it more within an international French neo-colonial context. So we've seen, actually, let me make this a little bit better, make some improvement there. Okay. Yeah, so we've seen in recent weeks, the tribunal investigating Sankara's assassination has charged Blaise Compaoré with it. You know, he's an Ivorian citizen now. It's unlikely that he's going to be extradited, but he'll be tried in absentia. And that, I think, will provide some important closure for many people, for Burkinabe, for people in Africa and beyond Africa, you know, who've been following this whole drama and tragedy. It's not surprising to most people that Compaoré is being charged. I mean, everyone in Burkina has long known that Compaoré was behind the assassination. And there's plenty of evidence on the internal side of things, the internal plot, the domestic situation, the coup plot internally. But the investigation of the wider international involvements, mainly, you know, that of France and Cote d'Ivoire, and then less so, say, Libya, US, and others, that's ongoing. And there's a lot there that we don't know. So that brings us to the role of France, which is really what I want to focus on today. I had to kind of choose either focusing in on a couple things or doing it a little bit more broadly. So I want to just focus on the role of France today because that's been in the news. And oops, hold on a second. How do I advance this? There we go. You know, there's a widely held belief that France was involved, right? And you'll remember back in 2017 when French President Macron was in Ouagadougou, at the University of Ouagadougou, where he announced that he would have the documents on Sankara's assassination declassified. And so since then, a couple batches have been provided, a couple deliveries of these documents have been provided to the judge overseeing the investigation, a guy named Francois Yamayogo. And then just this past April, news was made when that third and final batch of documents was handed over by the French ambassador to Burkina to Francois Yamayogo. And you know, I don't know what's in these documents as such. I mean, I've heard from sources who are in direct contact with Judge Yamayogo, and they've said that this final delivery contains some information, important information about the police and the National Gendarmerie in Ouagadougou. And we know that key elements in the coup came from the National Gendarmerie, people like Jean-Pierre Palm, for example. And you know, after the coup, Palm would then become the head of the National Gendarmerie. He was the second in command during the time of the revolution. And then once he took over after the assassination, then of course he'd get involved in torture and even murder of Sankara friends and allies. And so, and there's also been some recent reporting in the local press in Burkina on some depositions that have emerged that have been sort of leaked to the press that refer to a French cleanup crew that was involved. They came the day after Sankara was killed to destroy a bunch of recordings of telephone conversations and stuff. So, you know, I don't know. Again, I don't anticipate this stuff being made public anytime soon to journalists, to us, to historians, whoever. And so that's where these documents come in that I want to talk about today and just provide a little bit of just a thumbnail sketch of some of the findings around France's involvement in patterns of intervention in Burkina. So yeah, as Tokumbo was saying, I mean, the book, it provides more evidence from the US sources on foreign involvement in the assassination and efforts to undermine the revolution. I also did a lot of oral history interviews with people in Burkina and elsewhere, about 100 interviews with his closest friends and family, revolutionary colleagues, US diplomats, intelligence people, journalists, all kinds of different folks who were there at the time to try to get as many different perspectives as possible. But today I want to emphasize the use of these US documents. So in 2014, I submitted a FOIA request, which in the US is the Freedom of Information request. You can request documents on things. It takes a while. You got to stick with it, but eventually a couple of years after the request, the documents started to arrive in these huge envelopes of thousands of pages of diplomatic cables, reports and all kinds of different stuff on Sankara. So these are basically all the diplomatic cables from embassies, US embassies around the world, not just from Ouagadougou, not just from Paris, not just from Abidjan, but from anywhere in the world where there was chatter on Sankara. And so it really provides a unique international perspective on things. But today I want to focus on France and the role of the assassination. So what I've seen in the US documents is a pattern of French interventions. There's just an example of one of the documents. This is just 2 weeks before the coup. This is in late September 29th, 1987. And the conversation is, can the military stage another coup? And 2 weeks before, there's a secret document, and they're talking about the internal relations of force within the military and potential external forces. And so there's an awareness that a coup is coming. At least a year before, there was already talk about an overthrow of Sankara. Even in 1984, there was mention of Compaoré potentially mounting a coup against Sankara with Libyan support at the time. That was the discussion. In any case, so the pattern of French interventions targeting Sankara, I mean, this goes way back. It goes back to before he was in power, when he was a prime minister, actually, and he was removed from power in May 17th, 1983. And the French were instrumental in his arrest. In fact, they were boasting about it to US diplomats that they had managed to get him removed from power, and that was considered a great success for the French. And so we should consider this pattern, right, of efforts to undermine the revolution in Burkina Faso and to actually remove him from power. So France systematically sought to destabilize the revolution, operating mainly through their client states, through Cote d'Ivoire, through Mali, through Niger, and so on and so forth. They were even considering military intervention at a certain point, as you can see in this cable, where they're talking about discussing French willingness to use military muscle in case Sankara falls strongly under Libyan domination. This could trigger a French response, they talked about. And so their concerns were very broad. I mean, at this point, they're thinking about Chad. They're concerned about Chad. They're concerned about Libya. But there's also the concern that Sankara's influence is going to spread across West Africa. And there's a fear that the revolutionary contagion would spread to Mali, to Cote d'Ivoire, to neighboring countries. Sankara was very popular among the African youth. And so he was viewed as a threat to the African political class. And so the French were behind the scenes during this time. They helped to trigger the war with Mali, the Christmas War of 1985, which was intended to trigger a coup and overthrow Sankara. I mean, that was the hope, at least. I've also read in embassy cables about retired French military officials involved in coup plotting in 1984 and 1985. So there is this pattern, right? There's this pattern of French intervention, of efforts to undermine the revolution and even to remove Sankara from power. So let me just shift for a second and talk about Compaoré as well. I mean, in terms of, the timing of the coup, Compaoré staged the coup when the revolution was facing some difficulties. It was in the doldrums. It was increasingly unpopular. It was facing some economic problems. There was also widespread resistance to the revolution. Not necessarily to Sankara. He still remained widely admired and very popular among the people. But there was growing resistance from the labor unions, from even university students, and certainly within the bureaucracies who he had targeted, the petite bourgeoisie, as he called them, used their positions to sort of gum up the machinery of the revolutionary state to make things really difficult for him. As for motive, we know that Compaoré's rise to power was mostly driven by his own ambition. He wasn't a puppet. He wasn't an unwitting neo-colonial tool in that sense. I mean, there were financial interests at stake. I mean, there were incentives to taking power, to have a free hand in corruption and self-enrichment. So Campari set these different pieces in place. He was winning the military over to his side, right? Especially after the disastrous war with Mali. A lot of military officials were kind of soured on Sankara for his response to the war with Mali. Campari managed to manipulate foreign powers to make the argument that he was more moderate, a more moderate alternative. And then he took advantage of Sankara's mistakes in the economy, for example. And they saw many opportunities to occupy this vacuum that was created by his diplomatic estrangement and isolation, at least going back to 1986, mid-1986. For the Americans, it was really the bombing of Libya that began that, and then he was pretty much unreachable, wouldn't meet with the US ambassador, wouldn't meet with the French ambassador for a long time. And so he was diplomatically isolated over the last year of the revolution. So Campari was able to take advantage of these things, right? So that's just so we understand that side of things. Now back to France. So France did not engineer the coup from a military standpoint. The French government created conditions in which a coup was more likely, however. And so in many ways, it was kind of a slow developing economic coup initially, sort of almost a neoliberal coup in the sense that that pressures were being placed on the CNR. But then eventually that produced a radical regime change, as we saw on October 15, 1987. So a couple months before Sankara's overthrow, then France withdrew financial support. And that made up somewhere between 30 and 40% of the CNR's budget. And it had different titles, technical assistance was in development, some budget support, et cetera. And so Sankara's government by January of 1987 was facing a serious budget shortfall. And so this economic pressure then, I mean, that had the effect of exposing divisions within the CNR leadership. So CNR members then were actually reaching out to the IMF secretly to hold meetings to try to get an IMF structural adjustment program in the works. So actually 2 weeks before Sankara's assassination, the Minister of Finance was reaching out to the IMF to meet with the director of the World Bank for Africa, who was at the time Alassane Ouattara, and as you know, the president of Cote d'Ivoire currently. So in this situation of economic duress, then France was using financial power to place strains on the CNR, such that soon Sankara was hemorrhaging internal allies. And I should also mention it wasn't just France. The United States, for example, who was the biggest donor at the time, had almost completely cut foreign aid to Burkina. You remember that the CNR expelled the Peace Corps, right, 1986, and had been continually targeting the U.S. with revolutionary rhetoric and things like that. So in response, the U.S. cut its aid to Burkina from an average around 20 million a year to less than $1 million a year, including some very important programs like reforestation programs and things like that. So it wasn't just France. So the CNR is losing a lot of external funding. And just to contextualize things a little bit, so we understand the complexity of the relationship between Sankara and France. I mean, it was a complicated relationship, and France at various points did try to work with Sankara. I mean, yes, it was sort of good cop, bad cop sort of thing, where efforts to undermine the revolution, even efforts to remove him, but then at the same time, trying to pull him over to their side. I mean, Mitterrand apparently was favorably inclined. He liked Sankara, was even fascinated by Sankara. And he took the view that, Sankara was a young radical, that eventually he would grow up and that he would learn to play by the neocolonial rules of the game. But Sankara wanted to be treated as an equal, a peer head of state, right, of a fully sovereign country. And he wouldn't accept Burkina being a vassal in this neocolonial relationship of domination. And we see this in his public statements. If you read his speeches, it's quite clear, opposing debt repayment, criticizing foreign aid, for example, publicly attacking France, things of that nature. But he also knew at the time that he couldn't break with France completely. And the CNR was still, again, depending on foreign aid, especially from France. I mean, even with the PPD, the Popular Development Program, something like 80% of the funding came from foreign sources, mostly France. So a lot of things they were trying to accomplish still required foreign funding, right? But my research shows then that that it was Sankara's reluctance finally to accept an IMF agreement in 1987 that led to many of the economic problems and loss of political support within the CNR. I mean, you can see here in this document where Burkina's reluctance to approach the IMF or standby agreement is a manifestation of the pride and stubbornness of its president. Sankara keeps talking about conditions the IMF would impose that would erode the sovereignty of the country, and President Mitterrand's confirmation during his official visit here last October that French structural aid funds would be released only after that agreement was negotiated. Blah, 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 blah. And so, I mean, there's a lot, this is a tiny piece of the puzzle, but these are the conversations that are going on. As it becomes quite clear that Sankara is opposing any agreement with the IMF. Initially, actually back in 1984, 1985, he was amenable to it. And I talked to the Minister of Finance and others who knew all about this. They didn't publicly disclose it because it sort of contradicted the image of a self-reliant revolutionary state. But again, you know, a transition to autarky, to greater economic sovereignty, that takes time. You couldn't just do it overnight. And in 4 short years, it was just impossible. And France knew that. So, but France also used an array of other weapons: intelligence operations, diplomatic maneuvers, the use of disinformation campaigns in the press, right? And all of this then helped to pave the way for Sankara's eventual overthrow. So France was not involved in the military aspects of the coup, right? But they were then using these economic pressures, as I've mentioned, these other tools that they had at their disposal. Compaoré didn't need any additional military support to take power. He had plenty of internal military support, and he had control over most of the military bases, right, within the country. And Compaoré loyalists were in key positions, security positions, like the National Gendarmerie, the head of the CDRs, et cetera. So there was no need for French or Liberian or Libyan troops or that, you know, to take power. And that's pretty clear from the sources that I've looked at. But the French tentacles of influence were all over the place, right? In terms of military and intelligence channels, they were all over the place, especially given the large numbers of African soldiers, right, who had trained in French military schools. I thought I would just show you this map to reinforce the point that so many Francophone African heads of state were either had formerly been in the French military or had trained in French military schools. So it's quite astonishing to wrap your mind around those connections between the French military and the African political class in Francophone Africa. And then you had, you had retired French military officials who were involved in finding lucrative work in Africa, you know, providing security services, providing intelligence, trading in intelligence. They were there also to protect.
You've got a minute left, Brian.
What's that?
You've got a minute left.
Okay. Let me just jump to the final thing then. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, and so you had French military personnel who were also there, who were retired, who played a role. And then my last point is that after the assassination, Compaoré then promptly met secretly with French officials to talk about establishing close links with France. France had a positive impression of Compaoré, who was regarded as, quote, fundamentally better disposed towards France. And according to US cables, then Compaoré reached out to the business community, and get this, he assured businessmen that they will be basically free to operate without government intervention. He gave them a clear signal: back to business as usual. We're not going to mess with your interests here. Then he courted foreign investors. His clique took over the economy. He fashioned new clientelist networks, got involved in the smuggling of gold. There were new wealth sources in the wars that were emerging in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And then finally, the Compaoré faction reached out to the IMF and World Bank just barely a month after Sankara's assassination to cement a deal with the IMF. And so according to World Bank representatives then, on November 26th, Burkina formally requested a visit by the World Bank team. And that included, the terms of the meeting was to the desire to discuss a structural reform program. And one last quote from that is: the World Bank officials were reportedly surprised and pleased, right, that Burkina would focus on this issue so soon after the new government was named. So it would take a few years of negotiation for Burkina Faso, but eventually Burkina would sign on with the IMF-directed structural adjustment program. And so the neoliberal project had finally been foisted on Burkina. So I wanted to emphasize those points there, but I'll stop there. Thanks. Let me stop the share here. There we go.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian.
Sure.
That was very interesting.
Okay, cool.
Especially the detail around the imperialist intervention, especially in terms of destabilizing the economy that eventually, led to the coup, and Sankara's assassination. Right, thank you very much for that. I'd now like to call upon Ernest Harsh to tell us a couple of things, about Sankara's rule in Burkina Faso, especially the military aspects, and maybe a bit about his legacy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. You asked me to focus on the military aspects. A few years ago, after publishing my own biography of Sankara, I was able to give a lecture at the University of Ouagadougou to a crowd of about 250 students to discuss Sankara. I was a little surprised that there were a lot of details that many of the people in the students in the audience didn't know. So many of the questions were fairly straightforward, easy, factual. There was one, however, by a young female student. She questioned, looking back at that period, about how positive should we be about a military-led revolution. It was a serious question. I answered it at the time by focusing specifically on Burkina Faso, the history of the Sankara period. But in discussing it today, I also want to keep in mind a second level. That is the varied roles of the military in Africa more generally. And certainly from that perspective, there are many reasons for activists to be wary about military involvement. And those of you in Nigeria, I'm sure, can think of many reasons along those lines. Now, journalists often call the 1983 takeover by Sankara and his team as a military coup. That's because of the heavy military involvement, although there were a lot of civilian activists who were mobilized and did participate. Personally, I would tend to call it, and looking at revolutions in Africa more generally, as a military-led revolution, so not narrowly just that. Some on the left consider that a contradiction in terms. There were those in Burkina who opposed the Sankara CNR on that basis because of its military component. And I remember having heated discussions with Senegalese comrades in Dakar over that issue and talking about Burkina. But I think, stepping back, it's not useful to lump together all military interventions or think that everyone in uniform is the same. Some military actors have shown that they favor progressive change. They've been influenced by the same political currents and social and economic grievances as their civilian cohorts. Many others, of course, as we all know, have been against change. And to complicate the picture further, there are some who started by moving in a progressive direction and later shifted. At the time I went to Burkina during the revolution, I also would stop off and do a lot of work in Ghana, neighboring Ghana, where Jerry Rawlings and his team had taken over. And there you did have a shift in economic orientation in the mid-'80s toward the IMF and the World Bank. And as part of that shift, a crackdown on the left and on the independent mobilizations. And as we know, besides Burkina, there have been other instances like that in Africa, certainly from the 1960s through the 1980s. Since then, that's been much more rare. You had Ethiopia, Benin, Congo, Brazzaville, Libya, Madagascar. And they all had certain common features. The leaderships tended to be younger junior officers, not those at the top. They often had important civilian allies in the labor and student movements. They relied on popular mobilization, not just use of military power. They were politically more progressive. Some of them professed themselves to be Marxist or scientific socialists. And they were often in very sharp conflict with their former colonial powers, with the West. And they were in solidarity with liberation movements elsewhere in Africa and around the world. So when analyzing military interventions, we often see that the reasons have less to do with the military or internal dynamics of the military as such, and more with the wider political and social context. Because often the military, like other state institutions, has been fractured, and divisions between lower ranks and corrupt officer corps, some allied with radicals in civilian life. Unfortunately, in some countries, factions of the military will be drawn to certain ethnic political leaderships, which can be very divisive and dangerous. Now, Sankara, of course, from the photos we often see, was a military man, but he couldn't be reduced to the uniform that he wore. In many ways, he was very different from most other officers across Africa and Burkina itself to some extent. He saw himself and behaved like a political actor who happened to have been educated and trained in the military. That's why he went into the military initially, to advance his education. And during his studies abroad and in Burkina itself, he came into contact with revolutionary ideas and many civilian leftists. When he was being trained in Madagascar, it was in the midst of a revolution there, a military-led revolution, and he learned new notions of how soldiers should operate. They had these engineering corps that went out into the countryside, helped local communities. When he returned home to Burkina, he started applying those things to the military milieux that he functioned in, especially after he became commander of the Paracommando training base in Po in southern Burkina. He got soldiers to work with local communities. It broke down some of the barriers between army and civilians. And he tried to do that throughout, before he took power and after he took power. Still, you can see the military imprint in some of his conduct. He tried to convince people with arguments of the justness of his policies, but if they didn't get it, there was a tendency to push, to do things by command. Now that entailed a certain contradiction with his view that the revolution was a popular one, that the initiative had to come from the people. Initiatives did come from people, but not often as quickly or as massively as might have been hoped. Now, those kinds of shortcomings were especially severe among a number of Sankara's military colleagues. That was a problem because of the sheer number of them in the National Council of the Revolution. A majority were military officers. To some extent, in the broader political system, that was balanced by the representatives of the small left-wing political groups who were in the council. They were especially prominent in the cabinet. And then at the wider level, there were the mass membership committees for the defense of the revolution, which were in most local areas. That's where you had a lot of the popular initiative. But still, there was no doubt when arguments developed and push came to shove, who had the real power. In 1987, as things were becoming more tense, I got a letter from a former cabinet minister who was also with one of the small left-wing groups, who complained that when they had arguments and differences in meetings, some of the military folks would just simply slap their holstered pistols to make the point, who had the power. In practice, however, it often seemed that Sankara devoted most of his attention to the broader popular organizations and mobilizations, not to the military as such. In fact, there were only a very slight increase in the military budget. He believed that the country's scarce resources were best devoted to improving education, healthcare, and the conditions of poor rural villagers, not toward more arms and more troops. He appeared to leave strictly military affairs to his colleagues, including Blaise Compaoré, who was Minister of Defense. That was clearly a mistake. In retrospect, but also, some people thought it was a mistake at the time. During the last year or so before the coup, broader differences in approach became more apparent. They were probably there from the beginning, but they became more overt. Behind this patina of political unity, there were a lot of tensions. Sankara's overall tendency was toward inclusion, to trying to bring in more civilian activists, ordinary people, the poor through the CDRs. He had a different conception of political organization. He was against a narrow vanguard party that simply amalgamated the existing groups. He wanted some broader formation that would bring in other young activists, especially from the CDRs. That never got very far. But that approach didn't sit very well with some of Sankara's military colleagues. I keep having to say some, because there was a section of the officer corps that did stick with Sankara, and some were killed in the process of the coup and forced out of the country. Also, some of the other military officers were very, very, very uncomfortable with the crackdown on corruption. Whether they were corrupt at the time or they simply had aspirations to make some money on the side, they didn't like the direction that things were going. So as factional and political divisions deepened within the Revolutionary Council, those who were critical of Sankara's approach and had more of a militarist approach tended to line up behind Compaoré. They eventually assassinated Sankara, as we know, and carried out the 1987 coup. In that instance, coup was the right word for it. Its only connection to revolution was as a counter-revolution. So for activists, what lessons might Burkina's experience hold? I'll just cite a few from my reading of the situation, keeping in mind the broader range of military interventions we've seen in Africa. First of all, and I've run across some of them, there were those in Burkina and in other countries as well, civilian groups who happen to have political allies in the military sometimes see a military intervention as a handy shortcut to get rid of an unpopular or autocratic pro-imperialist regime. That, as we can see, however, can be very risky. Once military gets into power, it's very hard to get them out. We see the events in Mali over the past year, where there was an unpopular elected president, mass mobilizations to force him out, and then even calls by some of them for the military to intervene. They did. And they used the mobilizations as legitimation, but now they really don't want to leave. They want to hang on.
Comrade, you've got a minute left.
Excuse me?
You've got a minute left, comrade.
Okay, I'll sum up. But sometimes, often, civilian Africa's activists are simply presented with a fait accompli. They have limited influence over how a hated regime is overthrown. If that happens, then they have to decide what's the stance, to oppose or work with the more progressive military factions, and preferably working with, doing the best they can to limit military abuses and dominance and build up countervailing forces. I'll end by Burkina's recent history, which shows yet another option, which is when the military does try to intervene, to try to limit that and push it in a more transitional direction, shall we say, for a limited time. In the mass movement against Compaoré in 2014, there were some officers who broke with the Compaoré people. In the heat of the conflict, I'll mention General Zida in particular, they tried to sort of lead the transition, proclaim themselves president. That lasted only 2 weeks because of popular mobilizations by the political groups, by the popular groups, to limit the military's role. So finally in the transition, even though you had some officers, including Zita, who had important positions, it was primarily a civilian-led transition, which then, again with popular support, defeated a pro-Compaoré coup attempt and finally organized elections. So Didier, I'm sure, can tell us what has happened since then. Thank you.
Thank you very. Sorry. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right, yeah, because I think I lost my connection there. Thank you very much, comrades. You know, that was a very interesting perspective on the Sankara period in Burkina Faso, not calling it a military coup, but calling it a military-led revolution. You know, and also some of the observations about Sankara's practice and the question that even though there were civilian allies, that the military, you know, still, you know, held the power, and what that holds, you know, for activists, you know, in Africa, you know, in the future, you know, who are, or in the present, you know, who are struggling against the oppressive conditions in which we, you know, find ourselves. Right, I'd now like to call upon Didier, who's a comrade from Burkina Faso, to tell us a couple of things about the legacy, you know, of Sankara and how that impacts upon the current struggle, you know, in Burkina Faso. Didier, would you like to unmute yourself? Are you here? Didier, would you like to unmute yourself? Didier, are you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I lost my connection some times ago when you were presenting the speakers, but I tried to come back. I'm here. So I'm Didier and I'm from Burkina, and I'm an activist of the Democratic Youth Organization. It's an organization that covers all Burkina today. And we are supposed to talk about the legacy of Thomas Sankara. And what I can say very quickly, because I did not get the presentation of the two speakers, but what I can say is that talking about the legacy of Thomas Sankara, it is necessarily drawing some lessons from what happened during his period, to see how we can do for the future. What are the lessons we can draw from this experience and organize ourselves for the future? And this implies putting on the table, of course, the strength and the weaknesses of the period. So I would like to say a few words concerning the conditions in which the political context in which Thomas Sankara and his team seized the power, then the way they seized it, and maybe says few words concerning the personality of Thomas Sankara. Or if you want, we can start with the personality, because most often when we talk about the period of Thomas Sankara, people mainly have in mind the personality of Thomas Sankara, who was an honest man, a simple man, and let's say an upright man, a hardworking man. So a true Burkinabe, as later our inhabitants would be called. But it is important to consider the other aspects independently from the personality of the leader of the CNR. Because the conditions in which they seize the power is the result of a long walk. To mention something, you can say the political history of Burkina Faso has been and is always, let's say, a left politics, because Thomas Sankara himself has been influenced by leftists, as the speaker said. But, you know, in terms of running a state, it's a team. One person cannot run a state. So the issue of the team is very important. And what we can say is that for the revolution to have chances, some condition would have been necessary. I mean, a project of society and a firm group would have been necessary. Some will call it a vanguard party or whatever, but to say true, there was no party at the beginning. It's when the military seized the power that they tried to get a civilian support. And when the civilians came to support some of the activists and some parties, mainly the African Independence Party, when they came as people who saw an opportunity to run the state. And on the other hand, the military did not see things like that. And this will explain, in fact, the evolution. And if you can check the history of the African Independence Party, they have clearly shown that after 2 years of running, let's say co-running the power with the military have started expelling them, dismissing them from the center of the power, because they went there with the hope that there would be the decisional, they would decide. But after a few moments, there were a lot of misunderstanding between the civilian and the military. I'm not talking about the misunderstanding in Thomas Sankara's team itself, but there was a lot of misunderstanding between the civilian and the military. And of course, the real power was in the hands of the military. And I think that just to draw one lesson from this, if Thomas Sankara and his team had a kind of political program before they seized the power, if the population had been educated for what this program wanted to do, things would have been more simple to realize. The second thing is the way they size the power. I heard you say, the speaker, I think it's Harsh, he said, what happened should not be called exactly a military coup, but a military-led revolution. Okay, we can admit it like this, but truly in Burkina Faso, this has become something classical. Even if we come to the recent coup of Zida, it was the same. They made the coup and they came with some civilian supporters to try to gain the support of the population. So I think it's the same. Even if at the time, the political maturity of the Burkinabe was not the same as when Zida took over the power. So it was a coup. I think it was a coup since it was a small group of officers who organized, planned, and seized the power. Now, when they seized the power, the personality of the leader has given enthusiasm to the people. But it was clear it would be very difficult for the experience to continue since some basic elements were missing. This is what I can say for the time being. But at the moment, there is one of the African Independence Party, Adama Touré. He wrote a book entitled The Life of a Militant. And he has related the experience of their party, their collaboration with the CNR. He even said they were sent to Cuba to meet Fidel Castro on behalf, of course, of the CNR. And when they told to Fidel Castro that they have made a revolution with military revolutionaries, Fidel Castro replied that from his own experience and from his knowledge, he has never heard about military revolutionaries. What he has heard about is revolutionary militaries. To say what? That whenever a group of military with size power and there are no organs of running the state clearly defined before, it sooner or later things will be run just like the military wanted. And this is what we can raise as, let's say, weaknesses from the revolutionary parentheses. This is how we call it, the revolutionary parentheses in our country. But the Burkinabe have drawn a lot of lessons, including from the experiences before Thomas Sankara. Because as you know, the first president to be overthrown was Maurice Yamuego in 1966. But this was a result of an uprising. And soon after the uprising, and soon Maurice Yamuego left the power. What happened next was a military coup. Since the population had not planned for the military to seize the power. What proves it is that from that period until the period of transition after the insurrection, the military has never left power in Burkina Faso again. And their mode of seizing the power have always been more or less the same. So today, what we, young Burkinabe, for the majority, I have to mention it, how we see things is that we must draw lessons from those weaknesses, get organized, so that whenever another experience will come, the enemy will not be able to break things into pieces. Because when Thomas Sankara was killed, and he was killed by a group, I can say like this, because everybody knows there is the hand of the French imperialism in collaboration with some neighboring countries and some men near Sankara, some of Sankara's men. And when he was killed, what was what came after? It was a disaster, complete liberalism, and so on and so forth. It makes us say that what we need are not so the sparklers. What we need are strong organizations containing many revolutionaries, so that even if the imperialism and other enemies kill some of the revolutionaries, the struggle for a true revolution would continue. You have to excuse me for my approximative English. As you know, we are a French neo-colony, and we don't have the habit to speak English every day.
Oh, thank you very much, Didier. I think we understood you perfectly, and I thank you. I thank you very much for your contribution. Your contribution along the lines that you know, we have to take away, you know, the personality of Thomas Sankara, you know, who was an upright man, who was an uncorrupt man, you know, who within himself was a genuine revolutionary. And we also have to situate it, you know, within the context of the times in which it happened. According to you, it was a military coup, and they had civilian advisors, you know, but the problem still remained that the power was with the military. So the lessons that you're asking us to draw, you know, is rather having military men, from a Gramscian point of view, we have a network of committed, you know, revolutionaries, you know, who can, you know, mobilize the people, and there has to be self-emancipation of the working class. So thank you very much for your, you know, contribution. That was a great contribution from somebody on the ground in Burkina Faso. And I'd like to call on our last speaker, who is Sister Effiong, you know, who has spent a great deal of time trying to push forward the Pan-Africanist agenda, you know, for Africans at home and abroad. total liberation, of Africa from imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, and building a society where we all have the resources necessary to live, civilized lives. So if I can unmute you, Sister Effiong, and if you could give us your own take on Sankara's legacy, taking into consideration his unique perspective, on the women's question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, comrades, and greetings all comrades who are saying, can you hear me? My network is usually terrible, but I've an extra effort today to be somewhere else. So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Because the revolutionaries who have and his, I just
Sorry, comrade, we're losing you somewhat. It looks like as if we've lost. Looks like as if we've lost Comrade Effiong. Right, hopefully she'll come back to us. But in the meantime, we'd like to open the floor, for questions, contributions, clarifications, and after which we'll give all the speakers 5 minutes to sum up, and come back. So if you'd like to raise your virtual hand, and we'll call you. I've got first and foremost one question from a comrade who has a question for Brian, and I hope Brian will answer this when he sums up. It's, what was the nature of the demands of the students and trade unions? Could the demands be termed as counter-revolutionary, or were there, or were they genuine demands to advance their welfare?
I'm back now. I'm back. Okay.
Are you back now?
Yes. It's still all this time.
Right, okay, yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me just put it into as another African looking from afar to speak, not Burkinabe, the power.
Sorry, we're losing you. We're losing you. We've lost her again. Right, shall we go ahead with questions for, if anybody has any questions or queries or clarifications, if you raise your digital hand, then we should be able to call you. Any questions? Yes, any questions?
So I seem to be back. I'm really sorry about this. I thought I had fixed this problem. I appear to be back, Talks.
All right, okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm really sorry about this. I thought I'd fix this problem. Anyway, one of the key things about Sankara was that he tried to bring to fruition somebody like Samora Machel's position on the question of women, and trying to analyze that. And and usually when I'm speaking, on the women's question, I say that I've been inspired in my life, by three feminists. That's what I call them. And they are Samora Machel, Ahmed Sekou and Thomas Sankara. And there's usually a gasp, in the audience, because these are all men. But these are men, whose gender. Yes, and their understanding of the women's question was, powerful. So that was the key thing with Sankara, that he understood the action of women, just like Marshall.
Sorry, we're losing you, comrade.
Okay, maybe let me step back for a minute and try and change my network provider so that you can come with the meeting. I'll come back in 5 or 10 minutes.
Right, we've got one hand raised. So yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Abidemi, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. First, I would like to thank the organizers and the speakers. They have shown very great insight, and they have contributed immensely, intellectually and historically, to the debate of Thomas Sankara and how we can shape our future. So, having said that, I think a lot has changed between now and when Sankara died. Africa itself has evolved a new socio-cultural attitude, a kind of social tradition that is different from when people like Sankara were alive. It's now getting difficult to have young men like Sankara that are willing to take responsibility. It's now getting difficult to see men that are willing to stand up for their beliefs. It's now getting difficult to see men that are passionate enough. Africa has more population, but it has less of ideological people. When Africa was smaller than this, the percentage of men and women that were ideologically driven were higher. Now it's very so little. So I think we should focus on how all that we have taken from Sankara, the revolutionaries, and other socialists, how can we, convert it to a medium to empower people in terms of knowledge, in terms of culture, so that we can build new soldiers of the future, soldiers that we defend democracy, we defend human rights, and there's a lot to do. We need to translate the activities of this young man into what the new generation can understand, and then to what can inspire them. I don't know if I'm making any sense here. Am I still on here?
Yes, you are. Yes, we can hear you.
So, yeah, we need to look for a way. There's a wide gap. There's a wide gap between the new generation and an appreciation of historical relevance of this revolutionary occurrence that has happened in Africa. For example, I'm surprised when I ask young people just about June 12th that happened in 1993. They don't know. When you get to my house, you see frames of revolutionaries on my wall. They ask me, who is this? And while I was their age, I already knew who this was. While I was their age, I already knew I wanted to have his portrait in my house. But you see people that are now, that have come of age and they don't even know anything about history. They don't even know anything about revolution. Even things that happened 10 years ago, they can't comprehend it clearly. So I think revolutionary socialists must look for a way to bring this historical greatness to the new generation, to bring it to a language they can understand, to inspire them so that they can use it to, change their own generation and era. I think that is my little contribution.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. We've got another hand up, Olushola Joel.
Yeah,
yes,
thank
please.
you, coordinator of this program. I really appreciate the first presenter and the second presenter, but I won't talk far away from the last speaker's point of view, questioning the ideological gap that existed in Burkina Faso as at the time of Sankara coup. I was very happy by sincerity of Comrade Didier, who said it's actually a coup. And it brings the question of either revolution from the top or revolution from below. If Sankara, as at that material time, the society was not so complex like we have now, and that's the reason why we at the labor movement are, talking about even if we have, is what happened in Burkina Faso is a lesson for us. Even if we have a sort of a revolution in Nigeria today, it cannot last. It can never last, because just like the last speaker said, the ideological, consciousness, even though the population was small in the 70s, is more than now. With neoliberalism, even the labor movement, they have embraced the principle of neoliberalism unconsciously. Everybody wants to get wet out of poverty. And what am I saying? Burkina, I think Sankara was not really conscious enough to know the state, to read about learning about the state, because the state has to be withered gradually. Even though it has to be withered gradually, there are some steps as a revolutionary to draw the masses closer. The revolution must be, when you have attained it, even if you want to play a progressive politics, there are some people you must, once you know your class as a military elite, that the power still the anchor within the military rank, just like in Nigeria of today, is still within the military rank. So if power is supposed to, let us even draw examples from what is happening in Brazil. For now, Brazil has built that culture of good consciousness over the years, and if they are able to plan a revolution, it will be successful. But look at the current state in Brazil. They are wiping gradually that culture. That's the first thing. You wipe out. They are wiping it gradually away. You are supposed to attack some elements, immediately capture power and bring the people. It's not just a populism that people should like you. No, it's about whether the people, the power, where the power resides. The power resides actually within the military wing. Then, if it has reside within the, it would have been possible for Sankara to reform even within the class of people who came to power with him. They would have reformed a lot of things and everything. It is not possible for the external forces to plan any revolution or insurrection without the internal arrangement. So, and that's the lessons for us today. Even revolution now, we need to build a movement that is backed up by ideological theories. Education program like this is very, very essential for us to really know what we are doing, to differentiate our left from right. Without it, the state is so complex. Even now that this globalization has changed a lot of things completely, the world of work, you know, and you can see what the proposition of Germany to this Namibia concerning, you know, paying them for genocide. You know, it's unfortunate that the workers are lagging behind greatly. You know, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to ask any questions? Right, I believe in the chat there are some questions for Didier. One is Didier has said that for a revolution to take place, it must be necessitated by some factors. What were the factors that necessitated the revolution of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso during his time? And there's a second question, is were there genuine factors that necessitated the revolution by Blaise Compaoré on Thomas Sankara's regime? And we have a contribution by Tunde Aremu. From a little bit I heard some bit of the challenge of the interpretation of the 1987 Compaoré coup as a product of discontent from members of the military leadership and others in leadership who were intent on benefiting from corruption, which his leadership had made efforts at curtailing. What role do we think the international ruling class could have played given his campaign against debt repayment by African countries? Right, are there any others that would like to ask any further questions or queries? Right, Prince Will Alozie. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Yes, mine is not a question, it's a little comment. Somebody was saying that Sankara was not very much groomed in ideological issues. I don't think that is exactly correct. He was trying to do what he could given the situation. But my own contribution is about getting our people, but I mean people, the generality of the public, prepared for change. When we're talking of working class, I don't know how many factories that exist in Burkina Faso managed by people from the country. I don't think that it's going to be just like Nigeria, nothing serious. So what I am trying to suggest is that those who are conscious all over Africa would have to think out of the box in making our people know how to proceed. One, we have market women or traders. We should find a way of getting them involved or having knowledge of what is happening around them and why is it that they are poor. Right? We have, the schools are really have been overtaken by the state. Somebody was talking about the state. The state in Africa is a neo-colonial state. The leaders are neo-colonial leaders or imposed leaders or those whom the deep state have put in power. So we have to get around all that. Those who are going to church can use the church. The church, you can always interpret, if you are a Christian, interpret it in a way that it would lead to socialism. You are a Muslim, there is a way Gaddafi used it in his Green Book to get along something nearer socialism. It may not be full-blown socialism at a go, but something near it. For the women, again, which Sister Effiong was trying to address, thanks to bad network, she couldn't continue. That again is a very important area. So while we are doing this consciousness raising, we should also include the women issue, because I don't see how Africans can make it with our women not participating. In some areas, the women don't even come out. They are kept in the kitchen, they are kept in the other room, and they have no knowledge of what is happening. And so how would they rear up the children when they are not conscious? So that is it. So I'm just saying that we should bear in mind that the deep state, the multinational corporations, they are in charge of Africa, and we have to dislodge them by educating with our people through subtle channels, unions, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. I've got Oyuman G, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
From Nigeria. I really want to align myself with the last speaker on one side where he spoke about neocolonialism. Africa we don't have a defined blueprint that will keep us or put us on the edge or keep us to compete with the so-called developed countries in quotes. So-called because they are the ones now giving us ideas right from day one. They set agenda for Africa. And then our leaders also do not have anything to offer us. All they do is they work on policies, elephant projects that will never exist. They are there just to amass wealth for themselves and for their family members. So I think if we really want to move ahead in Africa, we have to be independent of the European policies, the Asian and the rest of them. That is on the one side. Two, talking about women, we have always had that African mentality that women belong to the kitchen, such that we even heard our president in Nigeria once made a statement like that, which is not fair. It has come to that point which we should also give the women a chance to participate. Women are great thinkers. Most at times, they are even the ones that help countries to grow economically, socially, and otherwise. But here in Africa, we have allowed the capitalists to take control. And then now what we do is we are not expanding our horizon in terms of business-wise to narrow it to help the less privileged. We all, like I said, all these things are just on paper to amass wealth. In the end, when we bring out policies that we want to execute, that we serve the common purpose for a common man, the European country now bring in ways of saying that they will still milk us again. We then fall back on them to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund, whereas all these monies that is there is money that comes from the African continent into those banks in Europe, in Asia, and the rest. The accrued interest, they still now borrow it back to African countries, and then we still pay back. So if our leaders will be fair to themselves and then fair to the African soil, it's high time they come to a drawing board. I don't know if having one currency will be good enough so that it will reduce the weight and the load of the dollar or the whatsoever foreign money hike. If we can equal our money with that of theirs, I think it will also go a long way. The single dollar now can help our African countries to trade better with our neighbors in one way or the other. And then this other issue of entrepreneurship, we embrace all these things without setting good parameters that will make this thing a long term. We look at the immediate, we don't look at the future. So by and large, all I'm saying is that it has come to that point that all these things, for instance, what we are doing right now, if we can put them all into a document form and then see how you can submit these things to, for instance, AU, African Union Summit, and save them to other African countries so that they can discuss these things at their upper and lower chambers and see how they can come up with better policies of developing Africa. It will take us to a long way. This way also, and then we can also see how we will be able to change the narrative. Hello?
Hello, yes, go ahead.
Yes, of changing the narrative of our reportage and also see how we can preach peace. There is no peace in Africa. Ethnicity is taking the better half of Africa. There's warfare between this and that. It has come to a point whereby we have to let go of the issue of religion and the rest of it. I am this, I am this, I am this, I am this. Is not helping matters. We have to, life goes beyond that at this moment. The introduction of ICT has now transported life, teleported life to another realm, to another paradigm. We now have a paradigm shift. So if at all we want to move ahead, we have to fix ourselves up and blend with a new paradigm shift because we have welcomed it. We are talking about digital revolution. Some states in Nigeria right now are joining the digital revolution kind of broadcast, going from analog to digital. So if we're embracing all these things, then let us embrace them also with a change of attitude, bearing in mind that we have to also judge our morals and our ethics. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I see that Comrade Effiong is back. Do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes, back, but it's still that old network. I haven't changed my network, but I will continue. If you can hear me, I might as well continue.
Yes,
but it's still taking me in and out. Yeah, let me quickly get on with it. So I was trying to say that Sankara, definitely aligned himself to Samora Machel's position on the question of women, which is still a very rare thing, even till today. And the essence, of that, the portion of it that I'm interested in, just touching on is that when Machel said, and this is what Sankara tried to practice in Burkina Faso, that the liberation of women is an act of charity. It's not the result of a humanitarian or compassionate attitude. The liberation of women is a fundamental necessity for the revolution and a guarantee of the continuity and a precondition for its victory. Now, Sankara obviously tried to engage, the female mass, in Burkina, from what we as outsiders, are able to understand, and to change the narrative on women and to bring up the question of women and power, and not just somebody who spoke about it, or had read about it, but tried to bring it, to fruition, to activate this. Now, this is one of the things, that would stand him out, even till today. Saying this because we have such, we have dearth of examples, on the continent in terms of upright, leaders, whether they come through military coups, or, genuine revolutions, or even nationalist, elections or national elections, not nationalist elections. We're so desperate and thirsty now to even have people to look up to, the question of integrity, the question of being upright, the question of sincerity. Of course, it all comes along with the question of structure and organization and ideology, and all that is important. But I think the question of, the example of an individual and the power of that example, one of the, strong points of Sankara, the issue of leadership, of charisma, in this question of politics, because one of the things we face today on the continent, and I know gone from women to youth,
Oh, we've lost. Looks like as if we've lost her again.
I think to be back.
Ah,
Yes, that the young people have nothing to look up to, no role models, no examples, nothing. The only place they look up to is to the West. So for me, Sankara history, or that he even came and spent that short time, even with all the defects, for me, is a very powerful statement. And of course, his strength, as one of the comrades, that spoke much earlier, said that he refused to bow down, to France. Now, while that may not have been a good in terms of reality of politics, but it gave inspiration, that it can be done. That's why, the question of, or rather the slogan of about, daring to invent the future and dare to struggle, dare to win, it is so powerful. So one of the, I think other things that, I take from Sankara's life and legacy is on the fundamental question of the outstanding need for continuous, mass consciousness and political education, because the other thing we suffer from, that even if we have what we see as a genuine revolution, imperialism is always able to thwart it. We have what they did in Ghana in terms of the 66 coup and all the things they do all over the continent. It's amazing, when you get into the research papers and you see the documents and you see all the things, they're involved in and who is involved with them from amongst us. So I'm saying that Sankara, for me, there are lessons as a leftist, in terms of the question of building revolution, from the bottom, up. As it were, and revolutionary organization, and the question of a vanguard, the absence of that, is a lesson for us. But for us now, people have said just the power of the legacy of his integrity, of his principles, I think, is still very, very powerful, for us to use. And I want to say one thing. I think it must have 5 years ago in the US, in Washington, the Black Caucus, what do they call the caucus? The ones in Parliament there, in the House, they being heard. Hello?
hello. Yeah, go ahead. We can hear you.
Yes. So I'm in the Black Caucus in the US. They held a town hall meeting, and they invited Compaore, that hall. Before he arrived, all the democracy and all of this. As soon as he arrived, one of the first things, he looked around, and one of the first things is people told the organizers of the meeting, this is the Black Caucus in the US, what do you call them? The ones in the House, the Senate, the represent, the reps. He said that he wouldn't be taking any questions. There wouldn't be any questions from the audience. So of course we had to challenge him. Yes, Congressional Caucus, thank you. So of course we had to challenge him and say, or challenge them, because they then came to repeat that to us, that there would be no questions. We said, but you've been lecturing on democracy. So how come we can't even ask questions? We understand if we're not able to ask questions from our leaders. Now we're in DC, in the citadel of democracy. Anyway, so after Compaore spoke, I had to, before they, could activate the no questions, I just wonder, well, there are really no questions. If there were any questions, there would be one question to Compaore, and that's the only question he faced wherever he went. Why did you kill Sankara? So I'm just saying this to say that even in death, Sankara continues to haunt, Compaore. And of course, the good thing is that he's on trial now, even if it's, in absentia. But for me, when I think of Sankara, and one of the other weaknesses we have as a people is that we enough of us Africans haven't done enough intellectual work, research work on a lot of, our icons, so to speak. I try to do some work on people have don't have information on Sankara. We only have populist information, but in terms of real deep study, there isn't enough of that. Maybe to say that it's something we need to look into, those of us who are interested in these issues. But on the whole, Sankara, there is a powerful legacy there of what could have been and the possibility of what is possible. I think, the lessons of how imperialism operates, because even till we talked, some of us on the left, in our different countries and in our different capacities, actually still work with the imperialists, not in a direct, dangerous way, but, we collaborate with them through NGOs and funding and all this other nonsense, And in so doing, part of, the ultimate problem, because we give out a lot of intelligence information without even being conscious of it. So I think that the archives, will reveal all of this. And indeed, for those who will take the trouble to do work in the archives, there's so much of that information. I found a lot of that out. My work on Nkrumah, which I still need to put together. There's so many people who, if we begin to call names, there are people who, in the public, they're very progressive and they have very positive images. But in the archives, it shows that, they've been, they used to give out a lot of intelligence information, to the imperialists. During Sekou Touré's time, during Nkrumah's time, that whole revolutionary fervor time, that whole anti-colonial struggle time. So I guess it's the same as the comrade who spoke first, was able to, share some information from the archives. But in terms of, and of course, this is relevant for us, those who are still activists in this 21st century Pan-Africanists, of some of the things to look out for in terms of how we work, as we try to push forward. And I think that, sorry, go. I was going to say, just finish on the point, that Kara's work on women is something I'd like to do in the future, a more specific, a more focused presentation on. To look at that and to look at the pros and cons of that. But I'll just stop for now. Hope the network doesn't take me off before then. Thanks for my talks.
Thank you very much, Comrade Effiong. That's a very, very interesting perspective. I mean, especially on the power of Sankara's example and what it holds, for the youth of Africa and how that can inspire them, to continue the struggle and to hopefully, transform, African reality. So what we'll do is we'll take two more contributions very quickly, and we'll ask all the speakers to come back for 5 minutes to round up. Amapoko, would you like to unmute yourself? And after Amapoko, Abiodun Olamosu, then we'll ask the speakers to come back for 5 minutes. Amapoko, are you still there? Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hello?
Hello, Amma, we can't hear you. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you'll need to speak a bit louder. Yeah.
Hi, apologies. Oh dear, you're getting feedback. Just give me a second. Okay, I'll try and go ahead without, hopefully you won't get the feedback. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks to the organisers of this forum, brilliant, and thanks to all of the speakers. There's a lot that everyone could say, but I'll try and keep it short. Sankara is one of our leaders who was taken out. I'll just mention another two, one of whom has been mentioned, Samar Machel, Amilcar Cabral, and of course there are those who were taken out via coups, etc. So I have a question for all of those who spoke, and it's something around, is there something about our focus on leaders which is a problem or weakness for the struggle of African peoples for, I'll use the term, social justice? So the first one, is there an issue with us and our focus on leaders? And linked to that, and because we're talking about Sankara specifically, but generally, can you maybe give one or two, each of you, some practical suggestions of how we take the legacy of Sankara to I'll use the term ordinary people on the ground. So that will be women, and someone's mentioned market women, our youth, and in particular, because one of the really upsetting things we're seeing with our young people is the number who are making that awful crossing or attempting to make those awful crossings to come into Europe. But so how do we take the positives and the legacy, the positives of the legacy of Sankara to ordinary Africans on the ground? And then the final part to that is there, what can those Africans who are outside of Africa, living in Europe or elsewhere in the diaspora, do to contribute to the struggles of Africans within Africa specifically, but generally? Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Comrade Bio, very briefly, then I've got a hand up. Kevin, then we'll ask the speakers to come back. Comrade Bio.
Good afternoon, comrades.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, comrades.
Good afternoon, comrade.
What I actually want to say is in respect of the fact that no one can actually take away the contributions of people like Sankara, and many others, radical leftists who actually also on their own believe in the socialism. Just like speakers have actually stated earlier, their contribution in respect of health, education, women, welfare, basic needs of life. So they are very, very sincere, but one important area that we're trying to hinge our discussion on is that there are limitations, that good intention may not at all times, mean the best for the people. That one may have good intention and that may not actually, achieve the desired needs, for the people. And like has been said, it's not only military, it's a major problem at that point in time. Nearly many of the African countries are being ruled or led by the military. But at the end of the day, only a few of them, can one actually distinguish themselves in terms of the good intention of how to change society, to meet the needs of the people. But that necessarily means that even at that time, socialism has been made very, very popular, across the continent. That people, even the bourgeoisie who are politicians actually tell themselves, to stand for one socialism or the other. Like some claim to be socialist, democratic socialist. Some claim to be pragmatic socialist. Some also even claim to be military, working towards socialism. But all this did not, failed, did not achieve the desired results. And this is the reason why I take this program, becomes very, very important. That what does it take, for us as socialists to recognize, to see that people are moving towards a socialist agenda. And I think it's in respect that the role of the working class becomes very, very important. And one cannot take away the working class, on the agenda or program of actually how to achieve socialism. I think it's in this respect that coup or military led government will not be able, cannot replace, the role of the working class even in Cuba, that Sankara actually tried to emulate, because he was more or less actually following the footsteps of Castro at that time. And Castro also helped the government, that government. I think the major shortcoming, of all was the same shortcoming that made in Russia and made the bountiful, act of what has been achieved there to actually fell and scattered. And it is the issue of socialism in one country, how much less a country, a country like Burkina Faso that was limited economically, with limited resources, and this necessarily means that for the new socialist to be achieved in Africa, it has to be on a continental basis, just like the type of program that Nkrumah was actually driving at, even though and a lot of his colleagues did not make it possible, did not allow it to be achieved. And I think even the Pan-Africanism must be, with socialist program, and what we are observing today shows the level of limitation, level of ideological, somersaults, in terms of the how to govern. People now are, even driving at ethnic politics, when the generation, in Nkrumah, some of them are actually driving at continental Pan-African, states, So this is the type of things I think the working class becomes central, because they are the people that are going to feel the impact, the effects, of any policy. They are the ones that are the extreme end, extreme end of the effect of such policies, and so they are in a position, for either good or bad, to be the one to actually lead, the type of country that we actually make them, to emancipate them, from the level of poverty that they have been actually dished in the present period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, comrade. Kevin, very briefly, then we'll ask the speakers to come back.
Thank you so much, comrade. I want to thank the organizers and thank all the speakers for the wonderful contributions they have made towards this program. Actually, we are talking about Sankara, and a lot has already been said, and we trying to see how the positive, attributes to his works and achievements could be relevant to the Africa of today. I just want to quickly say that the African people have actually tied their hands behind them, and are now, abating the neo-colonialist leaders that Africa has today. Even the African Union that is supposed to be there at the helm of the African and to work for the benefit of the common African man is now working for the benefit of the imperialists. What am I saying this? Because the African Union, for instance, has failed in every aspect to initiate peace in Africa, to create an economic atmosphere for African sustainability, health issues of Africa, like we're talking about the world inflated with COVID-19, and Africans cannot even come out with their own solution to the problem. And we're talking about hunger in Africa, we're talking about disease, no proper health facilities or infrastructure in Africa. So where are we and where are we going? The African Union has failed us. If we want to start, the African people now have as a duty to revolt against these neo-colonialist leaders. And if possible, review the actions of the African Union, or better still, bring down the African Union and create a United States of Africa, where new leaders of Africa will emerge and send packing all those neo-colonialists that are in our midst in the name of our leaders, and let the future of Africa be rewritten and the dignity be restored. Because there is no way we will continue to abate this. Every day we come and have good talks, and then we end up coming up with good reports and good resolutions and good stuffs, and they end in the basket without execution. If Sankara did not execute or put to actions his ideas, we wouldn't have been talking about him today. So let us stand up as Africans and take this challenge to our hands. And that should begin now as we speak, because now as we speak, there are wars going on where people are being killed across Africa. Now as we speak, Africans are dying of diseases that otherwise would have had a cure if medical infrastructures were put in place. The economy of Africa is in shambles because we do not even have energy enough to provide for the industrialization needs. What are we doing? Even the African Union we're talking about, whose headquarters was constructed by a foreign body. Are we Africans proud and dignified that China was the one responsible to build the African Union headquarters? Are we satisfied that there is the imperialists has taken over the leadership of Africa and the African people are suffering? The African leaders are not working for the benefit, for the best interest of the African people? Let us rise up and take this immediately so that we can save the people of Africa, because we can't wait another day to see it keep happening. Thank you so much, comrade. May God bless our delegation.
Thank you very much, comrade. Thank you. Right, we'll ask the speakers to come back for 5 minutes. Can I start with Brian, please, if you'd like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, there were some questions. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to respond to them.
Please.
But,
if you can respond to as many questions as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to write them down here as I was listening. I mean, and questions about what people can do about the importance of leadership, for example. And you remember Sankara, saying that to combat imperialism or neocolonialism and its networks of influence and control and things like that, you had to counter with your own network, right? He said to counter a network, you have to have your own network, a system with a system, right? So investing in institutions, focusing on raising political consciousness. And, Sankara, he saw that as really, the biggest challenge. And in many ways, if you think about some of the failures of the revolution, one of the largest was the lack of the ability to truly raise political consciousness, to truly decolonize mentalities, as he called it. So I think that's part of it, in terms of what people can do in building on his legacy is investing in cultural institutions. And that was one of the weaknesses in that Sankara did lose his civilian base eventually by the end of the revolution. But yeah, I mean, leadership obviously matters, but only if you have the grassroots organizations, right, in civil society that, to which, you're accountable as a leader, right? So that you're not becoming divorced from the base. And that was one of the problems that Sankara had, later in 1987, in the months before he was killed, in conceiving of a vanguard party. I mean, that was his main concern, and one of the main disputes that took place between Compaoré and Sankara was over the issue of a vanguard party and what that vanguard party would look like. And Sankara was ultimately concerned that it would become this more authoritarian thing. I mean, Compaoré believed that power was through the barrel of the gun, and Sankara was striving for a more pluralistic kind of party that was responsive to people's needs and responsive to different voices and perspectives. There was another question. I'm trying to look through here through the chats. Where was it again? About family. Where was it? Let me just see. Sorry. So about Mariam Sankara, his spouse, if she was involved in socio-political activities. You know, she was not as involved in the revolution as you might think. And for some, it was a bit of a mystery because, you know, he was so pro-woman, and there was the feminist discourse and praxis that were parts of the revolution. But, you know, Mariam was, she didn't really like the spotlight. She didn't really want to be a major revolutionary figure. She usually did not travel with him. She didn't attend a lot of the major events. In fact, people often commented on why she wasn't there. It was just her preference. And for Sankara, you know, he made it clear that, you know, that revolution, that politics, et cetera, wasn't really a family business. So there were a couple members of the family, in particular, Pascal was involved in revolution. Paul Sankara was involved in the revolution. But most of the Sankara family members were not directly involved in the revolution. And Mariam too. And I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question. I mean, she held the same ideals that he did. I mean, she lived a very frugal life. She believed in the ideals that he believed in, but she just didn't get involved in the political side of things in terms of making speeches and going to rallies and so on. I hope that answers your question on the family front. If there are other questions, I can answer them, because it's always interesting to make sense of a person's family life when they're also having this very public life. But let me just, I've been kind of altering my comments as I've been listening to everyone. And so I'm going to kind of move away from what I was saying before, which was focusing on French interventions and what I've learned from the FOIA documents, and just kind of say a few things about, you know, the legacy and to highlight how Sankara was going against the main currents of the time of the 1980s, the main neoliberal currents of the 80s. And that was, you know, that was part of, and I think it's something that is oftentimes forgotten or even sort of silenced in many of the triumphalist neoliberal narratives, that there were these counter-hegemonic struggles that were ongoing, that socialism wasn't dead. I mean, even in Europe, socialism was expanding in Southern Europe at the time. And you know, Sankara was part of that movement that I think sometimes has been forgotten about. You know, he made a lot of mistakes along the way. There's no question about it. But he also was very accurate in many of his critiques. You know, his critiques of capitalism, for example. His you know, his approach to global issues. I mean, when you look at a lot of his policies, even ones that didn't end up succeeding, they were timely. I mean, his opposition to debt repayment. Okay, it didn't bear fruit for the revolution itself, but it was a strong position, and he was in many ways correct, right? His opposition to IMF-backed structural adjustment programs. I mean, think about, I was just thinking about this the other day. Black Monday, you remember, Black Monday, October 19th, right? Just 4 days after Sankara is murdered, the stock market crashes by like 20%. So obviously the capitalist system was highly defective, and he was drawing attention to that. And I recall in the meeting minutes that he had from his meeting with the US ambassador in their final meeting in mid-July, and the two of them were having this debate about capitalism and neoliberalism and socialism, the role of the state. And he was just clear, you know, that the state had to play a role, and especially in a country like Burkina Faso. He couldn't just open the country up to capitalism, which is precisely what Blaise Compaoré did after Sankara was murdered. So there's that, and taking a stand against global inequality, against foreign aggression. I mean, he was consistent there. And as many of you have been talking about in terms of governance issues, I mean, I think he presented Africans with, you know, a new model of governance. It was this, you know, transition period from, as we know, during the 1980s. I mean, the heyday of democracy was really the 1980s and 1990s after the end of the Cold War. Not to celebrate that too much, but you know, he provided this new model of governance, right? A new sort of political architecture, and he really based on fairness, on justice, zero tolerance for corruption. I mean, one of the greatest accomplishments of the revolution was completely eradicating corruption, okay? Giving people a voice, right? So in contrast to many African states, and somebody was just mentioning this, you know, he wasn't interested in clinging to power. He was actually trying to devolve power in the final months before he was murdered. He wasn't interested in using his office for self-enrichment. Someone was making a comment about that, why people take power. So he was ultimately, you know, downwardly accountable to the people, right? And so for Sankara, the litmus test. Like the ultimate litmus test was, if any policy thinking about it was whether or not it helped the people. And I think that in the end, he stayed true to that basic ideal. And just to pick up on some other points in thinking about his legacy and the ways in which it's very prescient and timely, and even he was even ahead of his times, I think. When you think about the devastating drought and the widespread famine that he dealt with, and all Sahelian countries dealt with in the 1980s, right? The way in which he made the environment and environmental justice a top priority, right? So he really was starting to take steps in that direction of addressing the environment, of building a sort of green state. Some people use that phrase lately. And then of course, women. You were just mentioning women, pushing for gender equality and using the state to empower and also to protect women. So there are a lot of takeaways, I think, from his time in power. Even though there were mistakes, policies didn't pan out. He was dealing with many countervailing forces. He was dealing with France. He was dealing with the capitalist economy and all the constraints that placed on him. But nevertheless, I think there's a lot to be learned from studying the revolution that he led. So let me just stop there. And if any other questions come up, let me see here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry about that. Yep.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Sure, man.
Ernest Harsh, could you unmute and sum up and try and answer as many questions as possible that have been raised?
Just taking off on one of Brian's points there, I traveled to Burkina during the revolution, basically between early 85 and up through and after the coup. And from my own observations, I don't think it would be exaggerated to say that the Sankara lost his civilian base of support. He lost support from some of the organized civilian political groups, and maybe more in the urban areas. On every trip I took, I went out into some rural area or some of the smaller towns outside of the capital, Ouagadougou. In fact, on the actual day of the coup, I was in a village called Pibaore up in San Matenga province, and it was rallies and a lot of enthusiasm among these rural folks. So if there was a slackening or somewhat demobilization, it might have been mainly in an urban phenomenon. I only went to a few rural areas, but I got a sense up to the end that he was widely respected and appreciated. Somebody in the discussion period mentioned that Sankara was not very ideological. He read a lot of theory. In his office, he had a bust of Lenin. He had some of the works of Marx and Engels on his shelves. He read a lot. Just because he didn't make a lot of sweeping ideological pronouncements in his speeches doesn't mean he wasn't ideological. He considered himself a Marxist. He didn't align with any of the currents at the time that looked to Moscow, to Beijing, or to the Albanian model. And part of his problem with the left-wing groups there was they tended to be stuck in those late Cold War era modes, as Brian would refer to them. Amapoko said, how could we take Sankara's legacy to ordinary people? And his contributions, I think, largely were in terms of practice. What he tried to do in the period when he was alive. And you could just look at some broad points, like trying to build a state. And you got to remember the old pre-revolutionary state was Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and there's a few elites. By decentralizing and by building committees for the defense of the revolution around the country, tried to bring people in rural areas, villagers, somewhat into the political process, to have some contact with the state. The same in terms of building a nation. He wanted to build a pan-ethnic, pan-territorial sense of nationhood. And I think on that level, we could say it was a great success. I have not run into anyone in Burkina Faso since who would like to go back to the old designation Upper Volta, which is a colonial one. And to identify as a Mosi is, considered a bit not politically correct. He built links across the different ethnic groups, and the identity, Burkinabe identity, I think has taken hold. That's something that's being taken up elsewhere in Africa as well. But there's a lot of practical things, the fight against corruption. I know there are political groups in South Africa who've latched onto that for their own reasons in South Africa. To counter repressive and arbitrary rule and at least try to develop some elements of popular democracy, as they did with the CDRs. The Comrade Effiong mentioned his champion of women's advancement. I was fortunate to be at his Women's Day address in 1987 in this crowd of 3,500, 4,000 women at the Maison du Peuple in central Ouagadougou. And the rapport between him and the audience, they loved it. The women loved it. I mean, he would make jokes. It was funny. It was very engaging. And some of the men I saw at the time thought it was a joke, but the women enjoyed it. And they were given inspiration. Of course, there were a lot of societal barriers they still had to fight against, and it was a problem, but at least from someone at the top and someone who was male to make comments like that gave you hope for the future. So somebody else also, well, okay. I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, comrade. That was very, very, very interesting. Didier, if I could ask you to unmute and sum up. Didier, are you still with us?
Yes.
Yes, if I could ask you to sum up, and see if you can answer some of the many questions that have been raised, during the conversation.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So maybe you'll help me remembering the question, but I would like to make just a small summary as I was talking about drawing some lessons from the Sankara experience. First, it's clear that politics and state affairs are not a joke. It's not about goodwill. So it must be handled by a big machine and not just some individuals, some honest individuals having their good intentions. I side with those who said Sankara was not politically matured enough. I agree with Harsch that he made the best he could to read classicals, Lenin, Marx, Engels, and so on and so forth. What is also clear is that Sankara had ideological masters like Valère Sommet, the one who wrote the DOP, Discours d'orientation politique here. So, first point I would like to make is that to handle politics and state affairs, Sankara had to make a better choice. As a revolutionary, you cannot surround yourself by a majority of reactionaries. I think this has been also a real mistake. The second thing, in line with the ideological questions, is that political independence is prior to everything. But I think that one of the mistakes Sankara and his men and his regime made is to think that Upper Volta at the time was politically independent, and what remains to do was to launch the process of economic and social development. This was really an ideological problem, since they have not been able to describe and to take time and accept the reality, the characteristics of the country, because we were not politically independent. And when you are not politically independent, your hands are tied up. You can't undertake economic and social development. And I would like to take the example of some countries like Algeria and Egypt. Today, we can say that politically they are independent, but what has come next? We can see that there is an elite, if you want, the bourgeoisie power, and the working class is still in the misery. So the third thing I would like to raise is that we should rather build strong organizations and work patiently with our people, because the education of a whole people takes time. We cannot do it in a hurry. For example, when Sankara was still here, what was the reaction of the population? I side with the speaker, Harsch, who says that he was really, loved by the population. He was loved by the population because exactly the rural populations, etc., had for the first time seen a leader of his kind resembling their children, respecting their own culture, that is, being honest, refusing corruption, etc. This is why he was loved. But did they really know? Did they really have the political level to understand what was going on? Sankara himself, before being killed, confessed that he felt he was not understood enough. You see? So I wanted to insist on the necessity to build strong organizations. Look at the Vietnamese. How did the Vietnamese beat the French colonizing armies and the American colonizing armies? It has been through organizations, because it is in the organization that people can make their own education. An organization crosses times. You see, I agree that for an organization to be strong, it needs strong leaders, visionaries, etc. But the experience of Sankara proves us that it's not a matter of goodwill. If I can make a small remembering, you know, by the year 1969, there were many communist groups in Upper Volta, mainly those who have studied in Europe, in France, etc., and who came back to work in the country. And at the time, there was a project of building a powerful communist party in our country. And it has brought along heat debates, because there are some at the time who thought that the country was politically independent since the 1960s. So what we have to do now is to work for its economical and social development. But there was the group who thought that the country is not politically independent. And to see the road of development, we have first to
ask you to sum up, comrade, please.
Okay, to get the political independence. So I can say to finish, because the question was about the factors. The factors, I think, is taking into account the level of the population, because it is the population that should accompany any action toward their liberation. And talking about union, as you know, if you put together many states, of course, you will have just a group of slaves. But if everybody fights to free himself, then we can come together and really work for freedom. So to end, I think this is the first time I'm really taking part to such a debate, and I think you have to be congratulated for the initiative and for the efforts. And I think those kind of links should be held not only for the exchange of ideas, but also suggestions of concrete actions on the ground for us to work toward our liberation.
Thank you very much, comrade. If I could ask Sister Effiong to unmute and sum up.
Yeah, okay, so I'm here. One of the things you say, you know, we think that to be Marxist or to be revolutionary, we must be looking towards Russia and China. And if you're not of that, those classical schools, then, you know, not on board. You know, I'm pleased that Sankara was one of those that preferred to, you know, to have a global African perspective, as a leftist. I think that we need to push more on that. One of the things that we don't have in our societies, I'm saying on the continent, there isn't enough anti-imperialist history. I mean, being taught, consciousness, we don't have enough anti-imperialist consciousness. In fact, the vast majority of our masses are pro-imperialist. You see, so that itself is a fundamental problem in and of itself, you know, that you will find that even, you know, when we have left organizations, we're talking of socialism, if we haven't done that work of, you know, imbuing in our people some deep anti-imperialist consciousness, and that's specific, not just class, not this, anti-imperialist consciousness, because the vast majority of our people are pro-imperialist. We still, because of that lack of consciousness, you see that we will turn against even any revolutionary that comes, you know, because we don't have that. Now, one of the things, I think it was Comrade Brian that said that, and that is so true. A lot of the leaders, you know, well, the ones in the past and even those of us now, still don't see the essence of investing in cultural institutions. This is a weakness, even amongst us as socialists. We don't think the question of culture is really anything, you know, too serious. You know, we think it's all ideological. Cultural institutions, this is how they get us. You know, that's the soft power of imperialism. And that's something we don't take seriously enough. So there's also that, you know, and of course that ties into the question that was asked about what's this problem of leadership, you know, that we you know, on the continent seem to focus on the leader, the person. And that's so true, you know, personality cults, whether or not the leader even wants, somebody like Sankara didn't encourage it. A lot of other leaders encourage that, you know, directly or indirectly. He didn't encourage, but there's still that. It's because of, you know, it's just, there's a dearth of upright people, men and women. There's such a lack of it, you know, that when we see one person, it's like, you know, God has come down, you know, to earth. So it's that building more, you know, on that, and, you know, letting the people see themselves as leaders. But like I said, anti-imperialist history, investing in cultural institutions that locate us, that we Africans, ordinary people, you know, are able to see themselves in the picture, as opposed to, you know, when we see the Queen, we see the Russians, we see the Chinese, we see the Europeans, always. Take today, if somebody comes into power and says, I'm going to ban watching football, you know, there'll be a coup. on the continent. If you try and ban, watching Arsenal and Manchester and all these other, people, there will be a coup. I'm saying that, people will rise against you. So I wanted to, make that point, that the question of cultural institutions and, of imbuing an anti-imperialist history in our people is so important. Of course, that itself goes directly into the question of the deficit of mass consciousness and political education. Like somebody said in the chat, it has to be continuous, but it's just that gap is so empty, so it's filled up, with MTV, CNN, Alliance Francaise, the British Council. What's the other one? There are lots of them, and these people fill up all the spaces that we should otherwise, be occupying in terms of our people's minds. And of course, all that passes here for culture is very ethnic, very, very limiting, and just become entertained. But culture as a weapon for liberation, we've lost that, and that's something we, who are in this time, need to take up. Sankara's family, his wife, like was said, wasn't very active, publicly at that time. But when he was killed, she then became, in terms of all the solidarity that came from all over the world. And I think I met her I'm not sure if it was in France or Brussels at one time, when she was speaking about him, because pushing for the campaign, to bring him back on the agenda, so to speak, in terms of also, focusing on those, who assassinated him. So now she's a bit more active. I don't know what's happening right now. I'm talking of like maybe 10 years ago. It was quite a while, but yes, she became more active after, the assassination. How do we take Sankara's legacy forward? I'm just trying to go through the questions quickly. It's really about, first of all, popularizing, his life and his times, because it's so much more powerful, the example, the physical example, popularizing it, culturalizing it, politicizing it, taking into the mass domain. I think he remains a very powerful icon that we haven't even utilized enough. By we, I mean, revolutionary Pan-Africanists who are still seeking, to have this revolution in our lifetime, and also to have Pan-Africanism in our lifetime. So, what's his name? Sankara is a very powerful icon that we haven't utilized enough. How do diasporans contribute to the African struggle? I think that the first question is the question of building consciousness that we're Africans, wherever we are, because people still don't have that, People see themselves as Americans, as British, as German, as, Jamaican or, Caribbean. If we're not able to build that consciousness of a global African state, first of all, in terms of politically, but also a global African people, it's going to be very weak, because if we start to do some, revolutionary moves here in Nigeria, people will feel, oh, well, it's just them Nigerians, it's just a Nigerian thing. Even the left in Nigeria, some of them are hostile to Pan-Africanism. They will say, well, no, and this is a debate we need to have. A lot of comrades, I hear comrades saying, oh, it doesn't have to be Pan-Africanism, we must be internationalists. Of course we're internationalists, but where are you anchored? Where is your struggle anchored? What is your base? Where is your ground? I'm not trying to go beyond the Sankara debate, but this is the question, on how we understand Pan-Africanism, as something that can lead us out. And the other thing I want to say is that both in those, people like Sankara, even somebody like Nkrumah, even with all their rhetorics, and that, Nkrumah is somebody I have studied, even with all the rhetorics about anti-imperialism, people still do not know the depth of the evil capacity of imperialists, even with all the rhetoric about imperialism. So even somebody like Sankara, you can see that in a way, he was a bit naive about the nature and the dynamics of imperialism. Even there are lots of rhetorics, he would speak again and say ABC. That of understanding about imperialism, and sometimes people have an intellectual understanding of it, but not concrete, understanding of its day-to-day work. How your own family, your biological family, they could reach out to them through different mechanisms. They'll go that far to undermine the person, the struggle. We still don't have that. We still don't have that, because today you find a lot of people on the left, both in Nigeria and all over Africa, people are still working in imperialist institutions. We have our comrades, leading powerful NGOs that are openly in bed with imperialism. And some of them, like, what's this one? Is it the NED? No, it's not the NED, it's the something foundation. Maybe I remember and put it on the chat. There are all sorts of different foundations, different organizations, groups, these are imperialist fronts, but, you have comrades working with them. So in the daytime, people are talking, I know in daytime, people are talking about Marxism and revolutionary, and their practice is just the complete opposite. So I'm saying that if leaders, they think that they can outwit imperialism or the imperialists, even Nkrumah, he thought he could outwit them, but you can't. You cannot play, and that's a critique. Same thing with Sankara. Same thing with even somebody like what's his name, Gaddafi. The day he signed over the nuclear weapons, that was the day he committed suicide. That is the day he died, not in October 2010 or whenever. The day he gave up his nuclear weapons. So it shows you that people still do not understand imperialism. They think you can deal with imperialism through morality and the high ground and all of that nonsense. Do not understand imperialism. Even some of us in struggle today, we still have some illusions about imperialism. Then you can tell that we won't be getting very far. And one thing I want to say, comment. So I was just thinking in my mind when I was listening to all comments. Imagine if there were no imperialist intrigues. Let's just take all the imperialist intrigues against Sankara and put them in a basket.
Hi, comrade, could I ask you to sum up very quickly?
To stop now, to round up, but I was saying that, imagine if there were no imperialist intrigues against Sankara, he would have survived, and so much would have been done. So we have to really look into that, and not just, what we know from Marx, just our rhetorics, about class and this, but to actually study the day-to-day dynamics and modus operandi of imperialism. Without that, revolution going anywhere. The people themselves see the imperialists as saviors. They will imbue them with anti-imperialist, fundamental understanding. I believe it.
Right, thank you very much, comrade. We've come to the end of our meeting, and I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'd like to thank Brian Peterson. I'd like to thank Ernest Harsh, Didier, and Sister Effiong, for attending. Once again, these are their books. If you can see them, I hope you can. These are their books, so please try and grab hold of them because they've done a lot of very good work in bringing to life the struggles, and legacies, of Thomas Sankara. And yes, we must dare to invent the future, because we need an alternative future for Africa desperately. A future, which is led by ordinary people, by ordinary working people who are transforming society and cleansing African society of all the barbarism, that threatens to envelope us. We publish a Socialist Labour, we publish a monthly bulletin. If you'd like the bulletin, please send us an email and we'll send it to you. And if you like what you've heard, join us, because we can't do it alone. We need people to join us in the struggle for a better future, which is why join us and not only dare to invent the future, but let's create the future now. So thank you very much, everyone. And once again, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ernest, Didier, and also Sister Effiong for that very, very powerful presentation. And you'll get information about our next public meeting, so please attend. But also, most importantly, join us. We need you. We can't do it on our own. Together, we are powerful and we are mighty. We need to smash this barbarous society, not only in Africa, but globally, and create a future, you know, where people can be free, where we have the resources necessary to create free and civilized lives. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for all the speakers. Thank you to all the speakers.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you very much for all attending. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thanks, comrade.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all this, to all the speakers.
Thank you.
So what do you say? Oh. Well, the one I had, that's why I said it was probably just a bad one, because it had no taste at all. It was juicy, but it had no flavor.